Okay, it's live.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أحمده وأصلي على رسوله الكريم خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. Welcome back to the special program that we have during the first 10 days of the Muharram, jointly sponsored by the Islamicity, the World Council of Muslims for Interfaith Relations, and Stand with Dignity. And the idea is that we try to understand the events in Karbala that took place some 1400 years ago in the context of Reformation and the sacrifice of none other than by the grandson of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We've had discussion on what do we mean by sacrifice, what do we mean by reformation, and how should we see the interplay of both these factors in the actual world that we live in the context of the United States. We talked about the gender-related issues. We talked about issues pertaining to the race relations. We talked about the issues pertaining to poverty. And today we want to focus on violence. Violence has always been a major issue in our world. In the last century, during the First and Second World Wars, we, the humans, who claim to be the most civilized component of the universe, killed approximately 110 million people because we were unable to resolve political differences. Every year in our world, we kill 1.6 million people in violence. In the United States alone, from 1968 until 2020, we have killed more than 2 million people in violence coming from different, sectors of society. Wars have been going on. And what we call the rioting, strifes, conflicts have been taking the toll of individuals. And destroying the communities. The stories about the violence between Shias and Sunnis is not uncommon. Even though both of us claim that we follow a religion that promotes peace. The situation in other parts and other religions is almost the same. We had a long conflict between Catholics of Ireland and Protestants of Ireland. We had this Rwanda and then the tribal warfare, war going on in Ethiopia and Eritrea now. We have violence going on in at least 40 different places in the world the moment we are talking about. Violence has been an integral part of our existence. And despite all that we have created in the form of the League of Nations, United Nations, or Organization of Islamic Conference, or NATO and many other kind of alliances that we have created, we have not been able to provide peace and security to our world. Every 7 years, we find that the United States is involved in some kind of war somewhere. And we just came out from Afghanistan after 20 years presence there, in which thousands and thousands of people were killed. So we would look at violence, and then we would try to understand the nature of violence that took place when the events of Karbala were taking place. Let's look at the issue of violence in a more impassionate manner. One cannot attribute a single factor or one person, one individual, and one behavior in the violence that we have witnessed in our world from the time immemorial. But we can identify at least 4 levels of violence. One is at the individual level, where we can look at the factors that can be measured through demographic, age, education, income, psychological or personality disorders, substance abuse, and the history of behavior, in terms of aggression and in terms of abuse. So that is an individual level. The other level is the relationship level. That how relationship with families, friends, intimate partners, and peers, and the people in general influence violent behavior by taking into account factors such as harsh physical punishment of children, lack of affection, bonding, family dysfunction, association with delinquent peers, and marital or parental conflicts. So that could be another level. The third is what we can say that the community context in which social relationships exist, such as schools, workplace, neighborhoods. And we can identify the characteristics of these settings that increase the risk for violence. For example, poverty, high population density, high levels of residential mobility, low social capital, and existence of the drug trade and all those things. The fourth is the level at the broader societal factors such as social norms that create a climate in which violence is encouraged or inhibited. And it definitely takes into account the health, the economic, educational, and social policies that maintain economic or social inequalities. And of course, the politics is also part of that kind of thing. And there is a very subtle fifth place where violence is engineered to serve any of those kind of factors that I mentioned above. It's deliberately planned. As we saw that in 1953, when the Mossadegh government took over Afghanistan and then nationalized oil companies, the violence was engineered, was organized systematically by outsiders who wanted to topple that government and who basically used their local resources and their monetary resources to create that kind of situation. See? And one can give examples after examples of this fifth subtle kind of things, whose details come to our knowledge of way after the events have taken place. So we see the violence at all these, emanating from all these four levels. And constantly, who is the one who is benefiting from that violence? What we can call as the military-industrial complex. And political officials who want to use those kind of conflicts and that violence to justify their continuous power or hold to power. Our world uses nearly 12 billion rounds of ammunition, bullets, every year. Each bullet costs 75 cents. You can imagine how much the amount of money that is spent only on buying the bullets. So obviously, if those bullets are being manufactured, they have to be sold at all levels, at these four levels, which can be used. Much of the violence that I have referred to in the statistics that I have given does not come from the use of weapons other than the one that use those kind of bullets, machine guns, pistols, rifles, and all those assault weapons, all those things. So it is in this particular context that we would try to understand where we stand. We know it very well, and God would never advocate violence. Even to establish his supremacy and superiority, it would never. Because it goes against the logic of self. That if he is the creator of those he had created. So obviously, we'll have to look at all those kind of factors. One of the issues that, when we talk about the events in Karbala and the tragedies of Karbala, one of the arguments that I often hear in several circles is that why didn't Imam Hussein took the bay'ah when all others had taken the bay'ah? My response to them is that why did others take the bay'ah of Yazid when Imam Hussein did not take the bay'ah? What was preventing those people to identify their loyalties with those ideas that were being carried by Imam Hussein? Why did they succumb to the pressure of Yazid and his infrastructure when Imam Hussein had taken his stand? Why there was this betrayal? And why did they allow that violence to take place? It was a heroic effort on the part of Imam Hussein to offer his life and the life of his family members. And, if we look at the definition of violence, we find that it was the rulers, the power elites, who used that as a means to silence the opposition and to silence the voice of Islam and violence of Islam. How do we define violence? If you look at the overall picture of the definitions that are available, you can say that it is an intentional use of physical force or power, threats, or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. All these factors were there. It was a deliberate and conscious effort on the part to annihilate and to basically stifle the voice. And Imam Hussein knew about that. Yet he stood his grounds because, as we have been saying, is that life is important, but the goals of life become more important itself. So we look at the issue of violence from that perspective, and definitely we would have much more discussion on that kind of issue, and then we would see that how we can handle that kind of situation, especially when we realize that God Almighty does not promote violence, does not advocate violence, does not endorse violence in any form and in any shape. In fact, it says, Wallahu yad'u ila daris salam, that God invites you to the abode of peace in this world and the world hereafter. Yes, there are situations when one has to fight and one has to involve in conflicts, but these are not the aggressive methods that are taken by those who believe in the divine guidance. I'll stop here, and inshallah we will hear from Dr. Walji, and then we will have some discussion around our presentations that we have been making in these forums.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Dr. Aslam, for really contextualizing violence and the causes and the underlying factors and the five types that you outlined. And I'm just going to supplement this with the prism, with the American prism, as it were, to talk about the US and the impact of violence and paint a scenario and then connect that, as you did, with the Karbala tragedy and the violence that was perpetrated and what happened after the tragedy and after Imam Hussein al-Islam was mercilessly killed by the forces of Yazid. So visualize with me, if you will, that as we hear these shots ringing out at schools, at malls, at churches, gurudwaras, mosques across America, we cannot help but assume that America is more violent now than perhaps it has been in the past. It seems that in this century, American violence has taken on a new form. It's become an epidemic that affects every age group, every ethnic group, and every person in a different way. But in each case, the effect is detrimental upon whom that violence is being perpetrated, as well as the society at large. As Dr. Aslam related, that violence can take many forms, other than guns, physical blows, or wounds. It includes sexual assault, neglect, verbal attack, insults, threats, harassment, and other psychological abuses. So violence can occur in the home, in the workplace, public institutions, schools, healthcare facilities, and even on the street. Sadly, the violence present in the American culture today, both on the streets and on our screens, has desensitized our society. In movies, on TV, even on the nightly news, we watch the brutality and the gore whenever we want. It is therefore no surprise that crime has become more commonplace in American society. And through the American history, yes, there have been times of increasing violence as well as when violence seems to be on the decline. American society seems to be entering another rough period where we seem to be becoming more violent as we move further into the 21st century. Now, this spike, which is plaguing many American cities this year in particular, has lawmakers reeling and the police scrambling. I read a statistic that 316 people are shot every day in the US and 106 of them die. It even prompted President Biden to order a federal strike forces in to help catch gun traffickers who are supplying weapons used in these shootings. And for Americans who have lost someone, it's a grim reminder of how the cycle of violence never seems to end. It only ebbs and it flows. And all forms of violence, as I said and as Dr. Aslam explained, have damaging short and long-term effects on the mental, physical, and the spiritual well-being of society. The human cost in grief and pain, of course, cannot be calculated. In fact, much of it is almost invisible. Many of the victims are all too young, weak, or ill to protect themselves. Others are forced by social conventions or pressures to keep silent about their experiences. And as with its impacts, some causes of violence, you know, are easy to see and some are latent. So if we look back over the period of human history, that man and society are born out of both violence and cooperation. And that is how, as the psychiatrist Bruno Bettelheim defines, a paradoxical but inescapable fact touching the whole history of what he calls the children of Cain. Truly, the struggle between right and wrong began with Habil and Kabil, Cain, and continues to this day. The legacy of Pharaoh against Musa, Nimrod against Ibrahim, continues to the modern day. We see it unfolding in our own society, and what we see unfolding in Afghanistan as we speak is a case in point. How the two forces of good and evil are balanced in an individual helps determine their behavior. In the same way, how good and evil are balanced in a society helps determine the condition of a civilization. So in the US today, it seems that violence is ascendant over cooperation, disruption over order, and anger over reason. But this was a saying in 60 Hijrah in Karbala. Power was ascendant against principle, greed was ascendant over contentment, and might had become ascendant over. An important lesson learned was that when society is in that state, and this is what Karbala teaches us, and rightly the question posed by Dr. Aslam was that why did Imam Hussein not give his bay'ah to Yazid? And why was it that others did not stand up with Imam Hussein? It is a question on the basis that when a society is in that state to stand up. Without the contribution and the participation of women. Women were at the forefront of Islam's preservation right from the outset. As we see the history, I don't have time to go into the historical milestones. I'm sure that the viewers understand when I say that this was right at the outset. The history of Islam is the history of men and women together. This is in stark contrast to what the media and some of the Western think tanks try to portray and promote about Islam being anti-woman or the role of women being confined to the home. And we had a very spirited discussion a few nights ago in terms of how the equality and the equity of women and men is something that has been ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that that as if a woman has nothing to do with society or the ummah as a whole. Indeed, I would not be remiss if I said that the legacy of women is an enduring feature in Karbala. As we remember that, allow me to just look at the case study of one formidable woman who stood up, and her role in Karbala before the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and after the martyrdom. This was in the period before the day of Ashura. The dedication of Lady Zainab is very, very remarkable. But even more remarkable was her role after the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Allow me to elaborate. Ali Shariati, a sociologist, had said that every revolution has two visages. The first visage is blood, and the second is a message. The second mission of martyrdom and the sacrifice in Karbala, the burden of bearing the message which is announced to the world is given to a woman whose courage is something to learn from. The great social justice movement and the sacrifice can only serve their purpose when people come to know about the stand and about the tragedy, and when they realize what actually occurred on the plains of Karbala and how these people killed Imam Hussein al-Islam, would their consciences be stirred to do something about it. Therefore, the mission of Zainab was heavier and more difficult to bear, perhaps, than her brother's mission. Those who have the courage to select their own death have simply made a great choice, and it is a choice of giving their life. But the responsibility of those who remain is most difficult. The announcement of her brother's mission now rests solely on her shoulders. Naturally, they tried their best to hide from day one by introducing Imam Hussein as a rebel wanting to destabilize society. They portrayed him as someone who is hungry for power and who had no political experience or maturity, and actually made a wrong calculation on the account of the people of Kufa. So their purpose was to indoctrinate the minds of people so that they do not question or do not have sympathy for Hussein as a leader as well as a grandson of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, in this situation, it was an extremely difficult job to present this genuine message of truth of Karbala to the Ummah. We know that the mode of communications were not as we have today. It had to be done in a much more difficult way. Who carried this responsibility? It was none other than women of Karbala, led by Sayyidah Zainab, salamullahi alayhi. Against this backdrop, we see the ladies of Karbala with absolutely nothing in their hand, no power, no resources, and so much opposition that they were carrying such a huge trauma of losing their family members, their husbands, their brothers, their sons, and so on. And there stood Zainab, a descendant of the blessed Prophet, peace be upon him, who had just witnessed the brutal slaughter of her family and their supporters before the tyrant who ordered their deaths. The same tyrant now, in his court, further disrespects her brother, as Hussein had lay in front of him, and by mocking the head with his feet. Yet, despite everything she had just gone through, she showed great courage and strength. She held her head high up and powerfully denounced the tyrant Yazid before his subjects, and more importantly, before God. There are many speeches which people say reminded them of her father, Hazrat Ali alayhi salam. And in this particular haunting part of the speech, she said that I do not fear anyone except him, and do not complain to anyone else, and rely upon him alone. You may utilize your treachery, she said to Yazid, You may utilize your treachery, traps, and disloyalty, but I swear that the shame and the disgrace which you have earned by the treatment meted out to us cannot be eradicated. You shall never be able to wipe out our memories and inspiration from the midst, nor will you ever be able to wipe off the disgrace of these events. The fact that almost 1400 years ago, without fail, this event is commemorated year after year, never to be forgotten, is a testimony to what Sayyidah Zainab said on that day. So how is Zainab's 7th century legacy relate to a 21st century America? And I'll try and conclude on this. It's the legacy of Zainab that resonates with the traumatized people who have undergone violence. And it speaks to the traumatized because of her resoluteness in the face of the trauma. Because the trauma on the day of Ashura and before was perhaps the greatest of trauma that any human family would have faced. Today we find ourselves confronted on almost daily basis with people who live with a sadness that runs down their bones, with too many dreams shattered and too many tragedies that we see unfold. Sometimes our response is to say, now pull yourself together. But until we have experienced what it means to be utterly traumatized, we can't ease people's experience with a few platitudes. What Zainab teaches is to have to guide, that we have to guide and help people. The way Lady Zainab shepherded the surviving members of the Ahlul Bayt after the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Secondly, she also speaks to those indecisive people who, when faced with daily ethical decisions, are indecisive, do not stand up because they don't want to be unpopular, or they don't want to be in trouble, or that they just shy away for the stand of justice. The stand that Zainab takes before the two great tyrants of her day was much more than speaking truth to power. You know, this term being used to say that they spoke truth to power. Yes, she did. It was much more than speaking truth to power. It was about speaking the language of the universal truth. And that is the legacy of Zainab. And that is the role of women as exemplified by the women in Karbala. And that truly is an inspiration that we take as we commemorate these events, learn from the lessons, and apply it to 21st century America. With that, I will hand this back to Dr. Aslam for some more comments. I think you are muted, Dr. Aslam.
I think this is a message that we must remind of ourselves year after year, that how in these kind of conditions, women, can play a revolutionary role in fighting when all their men are dead. And when a large number of the community is indifferent to their cries and to their voice. And I think the message that comes from what you have described is that if we are a conscious community that believes in the Quran and that believes in the leadership of the Prophet, then we should never let any woman, regardless of her religion and her faith, to be in that situation again. That is our responsibility as a faith, as a community. And we should look at the violence that has been going on in our world from that manner, that in what manner we can use the lessons of what happened to make sure that we become partners in peace and we become a voice for peace and, and transition to peace. Unfortunately, we have not reached to that level of our responsibilities where we can play that kind of role. But let's look at some of the ways we can definitely play an important role within our own community and within. First, of course, uh, when we follow certain social behavioral patterns, certain political narratives, we can easily predict uh, that there is a possibility of violence in those kind of situations. So we need to, within our own community, monitor those patterns and behavior that might lead to violence against each other. So when we hear the rhetorics against uh, factions that we don't agree with, groups that we don't identify with, and do not immediately take preventive measures to stop them there, then definitely we are paving the way for the violence to take place. And the same goes in the society itself, that in our communities, in our states, in our localities, if we are not vigilant and if we are not keeping an eye on what basically is happening. For instance, when we see people making racial comments and bigoted comments against blacks, against Hispanics, against people of color, against immigrants, and all those things, then we must be able to assume that it is going to some sort of violence somewhere, as history has always been a witness to that kind of assumptive understanding of those things. I think there are certain measures that one can take at national and at regional level, and the Muslim community could either initiate, could be part of that. First is that there has to be a national action plan for violence prevention, and for that one has to monitor what basically is happening. And at the moment, we don't have any such agency. That basically we have, hate crimes group separately, domestic violence group separately, but there is no national agency that basically looks at the violence in a holistic and a nationalistic sense, and then monitor it, and then comes up with recommendation to prevent it in the right. So national planning to prevent violence is um, is something that would draw consensus, because unless people have their own political agenda and all those things. The second thing is that we still lack the data on violence, domestic violence, for instance. People say that every 4 minute a woman is raped. People say that every 20 second a woman is hit. All these kind of data is there, but still the data is old. Much is based on the assumptions on the past data. So the data has to be current, and certainly for that again, a national effort has to be done to have the reliable data on violence, because only when we have that data we can set our priorities and we can basically initiate programs and design and monitor programs and do things that would prevent those things.
Indeed.
Then the third thing is that we need to identify uh, agencies and groups that are working to find the causes and consequences of violence and all those things. The more sociological and more behavioral studies need to be done. And then the lastly, that in or a few points before the last is that we should also uh, the responses to violence should be increased, should be more uh, prompt and appropriate, uh, especially the responses for victims of violence. Right. So that's one thing, and I think there has to be some laws, some legal, and legislative measures to make sure that those victims are not delayed for years and all those things. And I think uh, our educational policies should focus on promoting gender and social equality. So these are some of the things that we could become part of, and but we would become part of that kind of thing when we start taking this violence uh, not in isolated events where certain individuals have this kind of deviation, but a structural problem that our society as a whole faces, where the hatred is sowed from the childhood against the other, or based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on race, based on status, and all those kind of things. And that basic, and in that, often religious institutions and the families, the schools play a major role, and that what we need to focus on.
Right.
I
I
give back
think,
to you.
yeah, picking up on one of the points that you made, and now I'm referring to particularly the Muslim American community here. Domestic abuse is a huge issue in all communities, and because of the cultural norms, in many cases particularly within the South Asian community, the reporting of domestic abuse does not take place as much as it should. And there is no outlet or there is no space for these women to actually go to and seek help. And it's almost like a stigma to try and go and seek help about domestic abuse. There's family pressures, and there is pressure even from some of the religious leaders. And I believe that we need to be much more open. We need to create an environment where domestic abuse victims are able to come forward so that they're able to be assisted, because this can lead to a very difficult situation in the community as the days go on. There are some organizations that I know of, particularly here in Texas. I'm sure there are others in California and in Chicago and in other states. But I think there's a dire need for this to come together. Secondly, to looking at the Muslim community, because this is where the most difficulties in terms of people coming out, is perhaps to have some forum where people working in this area of domestic violence can come together. They're able to share best practices and create a lasting institution, because as we've been discussing, one of the things that is preventing, despite all the talent and the resources and what have you in the Muslim community, is perhaps the lack of institution building, creating organizations that are going to serve. So that's one point that needs to be considered by the society, and particularly by the Muslim society at large here in North America. The second one, that while we've been talking about COVID and the pandemic and the issues that we're having, I have seen in the last few years in particular there is a very subtle pandemic, and that pandemic is of mental unwellness. They call it mental health. To be politically correct, I call it mental unwellness. And there are many, many issues that prevail in terms of the mental health within communities. This is the other trait that we have in our society, particularly the South Asian society and maybe the Middle Eastern society, that tries to again hide the issues of mental illness within the family, within the home. And I'm part of a group called the American Muslim Health Professionals, and we have offered free, for example, free mental health first aid courses so that caregivers, family members can come and join these courses and are able to pick on the very first signs of mental health issues with a family member or a congregant in a mosque or wherever. And these are the kind of initiatives that are needed more than most, so that we are able to do this, because it's all very well to have ritual practices in our mosques, but unless our mosques, our societies are going to be able to tackle the issues, the generations that are coming up are not immune from the wider malaise of the society. And mental health is one of the key issues that needs to be addressed. And obviously, the issues of mental health are created because of subtle violence, because of the family structure. In some cases, there may be other reasons. But all these reasons come together. The result is a community that is not well mentally cannot be a good community. And that's something that we need to focus on. Back to you, Dr. Aslam.
I think the crucial point here is that the community should objectively look at the issues that it is facing. Many a time we are in a state of denial. We don't realize that there are certain issues that require our urgent understanding. And in that respect, I would mention a few. First of all, the domestic violence, of course. We are no different than the 40% those American families where this kind of issue prevails. Domestic violence does not necessarily mean only that you physically hit, emotional, verbal abuse, and all those kind of things. And I'm sure as a community activist, we may know many such cases where all these kind of things happen. So this is one of the issues. Child abuse is another issue where all these things happen. Then the hatred that we promote based on our own theological differences. And I'm not talking about the written words, I'm talking the spoken words, where we pass comments about the other communities and other factions and other sections of the community without understanding the implications of what we are saying on the mind of a young child. When you expose a 5 or 6-year-old kid to that kind of language that is full of hatred towards others, what do you expect from him when he would grow up from that? And when you come up with the stories about the people deviant or not loyal to Islam, not so that is also something that promotes a kind of verbal or emotional violence against others and all those kind of things. And the same goes with the rest of the society, that if you have an attitude of negative perspectives of the society as a whole, and you see as that society, the American society, as a society that is composed of lewdness, that is composed of immoral behavior, and obviously you would have your own judgment towards that. So these are the issues that we need to basically look into. And then one of the issues that probably we need to incorporate in our own teachings and all those things is that, and I think this is something that I find within the Muslim curriculum missing. Neither the Shia curriculum nor the Sunni curriculum that we teach to our children focuses on developing an integral community, an integrated community. And that, of course, has its major problems. Because what would happen is that you would never be able to produce a generation that would be respectful to each other. There would always be tensions. There would always be questions in the mind of both who have been exposed to this kind of sectarian understanding of the faith. There are certain common grounds that we can all agree. We can all agree on the sacrifice of Imam Hussein. We can all agree on the sacrifice of women of Karbala. We can all agree on the courageousness. We can all agree on their reference to the Quran, on their reference to the Sunnah of the Prophet. Our sources may be different, but still the main source is the same, that is the Prophet itself. So we would not be able to resolve all the issues, but we could at least give an understanding of each other's perspective with respect and with dignity. And that is what is lacking in our communities at this time. How many masajid have the educational program on Muharram? Only the Shia masajid. Why should it be? Is Imam Hussein only a Shia hero? Was he not the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Did he not believe in the Quran? Did he not promote those kind of ideals that the Prophet? So all those things we need to look at directly. And I think what we are doing is that we are basically deflating the spirit of Islam, which is universal, into a historical and sectarian kind of attitude. And that needs to be challenged. And inshallah, in this country, we hope that there would emerge a synthesis. We can still retain our own identities and our own ideas about certain understanding and interpretation of the Quran, but we can always come together. And violence is one such issue that definitely we have to come together. We have to come together to ensure that violence does not creep into any part of our brain, neither verbal nor emotional, nor written, nor actual. Because yes, in this country, the law would prevent you taking from, the actual actions, but emotional, verbal, the verbal violence goes on, and that needs to stop. And I think, in that respect, there is an urgent need that the leaders of both the communities come together to basically think in terms of developing at least some rudimentary course that could help each other build bridges at the grassroots level, because we are talking of our new generations. Many of us have come with our own stereotypical images of each other from back home. And many of us have imparted those kind of language and those kind of issues to our younger generations and all those things. But we should not basically destroy the coming generation. And we should focus on developing them, that, within your own individual identity, your sectarian identity, there is a room for a universal identity of Islam, and that is what we should focus on.
Indeed. I think it's a path. In terms of what we have now. Is sometimes I find this a tacit tolerance of each other within the sort of sectarian divide. And I think to talk about tacit tolerance is not a good thing, because if I were to say that I tolerate you, Dr. Ashtam, it's not a very good thing to say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the idea of that tolerance or the tacit tolerance that we have needs to convert into a space where, we have understanding. That if there was dialogue, if there was understanding, the step that understanding each other would give us would be a state then of mutual respect. And I believe that we need to go from tolerance to understanding to mutual respect, and ultimately resulting on what our Maker wants us to do is to help each other, to serve each other, and in order to do that, to love each other. And to actually have that emanating within a society, be it the Shia-Sunni divide, or be it the Muslim-Christian divide, or be it any other divide within humanity. I believe that that is the sort of universal value of truth and justice that can bring us about this, and we need to have those core values of empathy, of integrity, of compassion amongst us. And now these are big words, but this is something which is intrinsic in the human spirit. We can do it if there was an environment that was created, and if there are enough critical mass to be able to do it. And as we were discussing with Dr. Huck and others a few nights ago, that the upcoming generation has a lot of promise. They may not have the baggage that we may have carried, our peers would have carried with them wherever they may have come from. Growing up, born and bred in this part of the world gives them a particular, perhaps, advantage to be able to move on from what we call the tacit tolerance amongst each other towards a place where we can begin to understand each other. With that said, we've got a few more minutes, Dr. Aslam,
Yeah,
for your
I
concluding
think
remarks.
it's a very promissory note, but it all would depend on how we educate our younger generation, because the impressions that they would have at this tender age would stay for them for long, somewhere in the back of their mind, and it would come out in one way or the other, as the human psychology tells us. So somehow we have to work towards that curriculum that we teach in our schools, uh, and somehow the families need to be in tune with that curriculum, that we at least show respect, uh, more than tolerance, as you rightly put it, so that these generations could grow in the best possible manner. I mean, look at the contribution of Muslim scientists. Many of them were Shias, many of them were Sunnis. Yet we all take them as our common heritage. Nobody says that we should not accept uh, a particular scholar or a scientist in high esteem because he happens to be a Shia or he happens to be a Sunni. So we need to reach to that point where we can develop that kind of confidence towards each other. So I think in the end, we would say that perhaps we have enough grounds and enough theological foundation for creating a peaceful environment and peaceful community vis-a-vis with others and within our own self. All we need to do is that be bold in terms of addressing issues and making our centers and our mosques more change-oriented, reformation-oriented, and more sacrifice-oriented in that particular context. We'll have the last word from you, and then please conclude it with the dua.
Inshallah. Thank you. I think these conversations certainly help, and we hope that our viewers are able to also resonate with some of the messages that we are discussing here. It's really all to do with creating what we call, and the call is upon us, that on the one hand, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we have created you from the best of moles And the second one is that we have created you as Ummat Wasata. So here Allah is talking about the individual as, ahsani taqweem, in the best of form. And there Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about Ummat Wasata, a nation most balanced. So if you have the best of forms in terms of the human beings and Ummat Wasata, which is the Muslim community, as it were, that's how we understand it, then there is hope that just as the drops of water would make waves together, alone they can do very little. And we need to build that critical mass to be able to bring about the Islah. And for that Islah, as we have been talking, it requires sacrifice. And really bringing that back to the spirit of Karbala, of Islah, of reform and sacrifice, is what is needed in every society. And each one of us will be asked on the day of judgment to say that we gave you the opportunities. What did you do with your time? So we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us a tawfiq to be able to utilize the time that He has given us in the service of the community. We pray to Allah to give our community the blessing and the tawfiq to be able to increase the level of understanding and love so that we are able to better exist as a community. And we will end with Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Al-Asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil-haqqi wa tawasaw bil-sabr. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Wassalamu
Thank you.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. We come to a closure to this night's presentation. Inshallah, we'll again meet tomorrow. Tomorrow we will have Dr. Musa Azam, who would be talking about Islamic values and inspirations for change and for reformation. And then day after would be the last day of our presentation, where we would have a discussion on the role the Shia and Sunni scholars can play in terms of bringing about the consensus or some sort of ideological congruence on issues pertaining to reformation and sacrifice. Thank you very much once again, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless each one.